What makes for good science? Is it being as objective as humanly possible, so as to only let the facts speak? Is it following the scientific method perfectly to come to a conclusion, or only assigning statistical significance upon receiving a p-value of under 0.05? Well, chances are that if you've learned science from a Western perspective, these are all ideal conditions. But does this narrow approach always yield the best results? And why does mainstream science seem to only exist within the confines of a Western linear line of logic? Leroy Littlebear, a Blackfoot researcher, professor, and recognized First Nations leader, claims that if science is a search for reality, if science is a search for knowledge at the leading edges of the humanly knowable, then there are sciences other than the Western science of measurement. In that spirit, and in an effort to decolonize science, we'll delve into Indigenous science, how it differs from Western science, and its importance. An important way to begin this journey is by adopting an Indigenous research paradigm. Sean Wilson, in Research's Ceremony, Indigenous Research Methods, describes an Indigenous research paradigm as a set of beliefs or assumptions upon which research is based, which incorporates Indigenous ways of knowing. It differs from Western research paradigms in that it puts emphasis on relationality, claiming that all things are related and therefore relevant. Western paradigms may often amputate aspects of a subject by looking at individual components rather than the whole picture. While Western science often practices reductionism in its thinking, Indigenous science is holistic and interconnected. Conrad House's art piece, Through the Native Eye, reflects this idea perfectly. In the bottom right, you can see the native eye, which looks at the tapestry of relationships and accurately conveys Indigenous science as one founded on interdependence with nature. Now let's look at some ways that decolonizing Western science and applying Indigenous principles might improve it. The holistic nature of Indigenous knowledge may be particularly valuable in regard to monitoring climate change. Western science will often dismiss short-term variation in climate change due to rigid statistical requirements. But Indigenous understandings are typically defined by cues and patterns, such as the appearance of snow on a mountain or the emergence of a species of ant or berry. These experiential views can be more sensitive to changes due to its emphasis on relationships. This science is not in line with strict Western notions of science, and regardless, yield incredible results. But Indigenous knowledge doesn't just inform land management practices and climate science. It can also be used to explain complex theories Western scientists struggle to wrap their heads around. Leroy Littlebear makes a powerful case for the potential that Indigenous paradigms may have in regard to understanding concepts like quantum physics. He speaks about his relationship from a Blackfoot perspective, but claims that many other Native people in North America hold similar beliefs. For Blackfoot, the foundational basis is constant flux, where everything is in constant motion. In quantum physics, constant motion and flux is also an integral part of its discipline. Another has to do with energy waves. Western physicists tend to talk about everything in terms of matter. For Blackfoot, everything is talked about in energy waves, which at their core are spirits, which enable them to build relationships. Likewise, in quantum physics, we talk about subatomic particles, which behave wave-like. A third part is that Western thought considers people, animals, and sometimes plants animate, but will not do the same for rivers and rocks and more. On the contrary, for Blackfoot, everything is animate. Inanimacy does not exist in language. This mentality has been labeled primitive and folkloric by many Western scientists who use strict guidelines to determine if something is or is not animate. Interestingly, however, in quantum physics, research experiments, such as the double-slit experiment, have found that in many ways, subatomic particles are found in all matter, whether it be a rock or a person, and technically show signs of animacy. This finding aligns a lot more with Indigenous ways of thought in regard to animacy than Western. Perhaps physicists could incorporate this kind of language and philosophy to better understand these concepts, which are at odds with a lot of Western language and reasoning. The world is vastly complex and intertwined. While a linear approach to research may provide us with clear and concise answers, it can sometimes compromise realism. We need to broaden our worldview in order to understand science, which governs our convoluted world. And decolonizing mainstream science through the implementation of indigenous knowledge is definitely a start.